Inspector Morse. The frame was empty, but glass was shattered. Original TV adaptation. The first cold of the year had a peculiar sharpness, the sort that pared everything down to its edges. I'd been standing on Magdalen Bridge longer than was strictly necessary, watching the deer in the park moving in slow arcs through the thin veil of mist. The water below was slate and silent, disturbed only by the occasional sigh of a passing punt. In such light, the college stones seemed older than history itself, as if they might crumble into dust if one looked too intently. It was then I saw her. A red scarf knotted at the throat, hair catching the weak sun for a moment before disappearing into shadow. She crossed the quad with quick, decisive steps, heels striking the flagstones in a rhythm that carried further than it should have in the damp air. I could not have explained why the image fixed itself in my mind, only that it did. People pass us every day, but some inexplicably leave an imprint. I walked on slowly, pausing to glance up at the high windows where the frost had patterned itself into delicate maps of nowhere. The streets were still half asleep, the air thick with the smell of roasting coffee from a shop I rarely entered for fear of running into too many familiar faces. My own coffee waited in the kitchen of my flat, already turning lukewarm by the time I reached it. It was while drinking it, the bitter dregs swirled in the cup, that I saw the notice. Halfway down the page of the Oxford Mail, beneath the usual litany of parking disputes and council debates about lighting in the high street. Local art restorer found dead at home. Police not treating as suspicious. The sentence was too neatly constructed, too easily dismissed. One could almost hear the reporter folding away his notes with relief. I read it again. Her name, Margaret Ainsworth, carried with it no instant recognition, but there was something in the pairing of her profession with the manner of her death that caught. A restorer of art. One whose business is to bring back what time has faded, to repair what hands or neglect have harmed. Yet now she was beyond repair herself. The phrase "not treating as suspicious" seemed to me the most suspicious part. It is the sort of reassurance offered only when there might be reason to think otherwise. And so, despite no one having yet asked me to take an interest, I felt the familiar restlessness settle in. A crossword lay open beside me, abandoned earlier that morning. One clue remained unsolved. Frame without picture contains a point. The answer came now, without effort. Glass, of course, transparent, fragile, and yet a boundary between what is seen and what is preserved. I let the word linger in my mind longer than the clue deserved. Outside, the clouds were lowering over the spire of St. Mary's, and a thin rain had begun to tick at the sill. I could almost hear the echo of those heels again on the stone, the red scarf vanishing into the mist. I told myself it was nothing, that I had files enough on my desk to keep me in work until the new year. But the image of the broken glass in that crossword, paired now with the art restorer's name, began to align itself in my mind in a way I could not quite ignore. Perhaps it was only habit, the unwillingness to let go of anything imperfectly understood. Or perhaps, though I would never admit it then, it was that same quiet pull that has led me, more times than I care to count, towards the lives of strangers who have already ceased to speak for themselves. I folded the paper, slid it beneath a pile of letters, and poured myself another cup. Even as the kettle boiled, I knew I would not be leaving it there. Some mornings begin without promise, and yet they find their way, by slow degrees, into something else entirely. That morning began with a red scarf and a line in the paper. It ended much later in a house where the smell of turpentine clung to the air and a gilt frame hung empty on the wall. But that, as they say, is another chapter. Lewis had a habit of driving as though each street concealed a trap only he could foresee. It made the journey to Margaret Ainsworth's house feel longer than it was, the slow crawl through terraced rows of soot-darkened brick, broken only by the occasional lurch when he remembered to change gear. Rain freckled the windscreen, pooling in little arcs where the wipers missed. We stopped outside a narrow frontage, its small garden overgrown, as though no one had stepped through the gate in months. Inside, the air was sharp with turpentine and something older, the unwashed scent of linen curtains drawn too long against the light. The hall was narrow, papered in a pale green that had blistered in places. I could see, from the bottom of the stairs, where the scuffed edges of the carpet bunched slightly near the third step, a place where a heel might catch. I did not need Lewis to point out where they said she had fallen. The sitting room was dim even with the curtains open. On the far wall above a low cabinet hung the frame. It was the sort of gilt that no longer pretends to be gold, the edges worn into a dulled brass, but the craftsmanship still exact, the curls and leaf patterns cut deep enough to hold shadow. The glass within was broken, jagged at the lower right corner, the rest holding together by stubbornness alone. No painting behind it. I stood close enough to see my own reflection fractured in its surface. Ran a fingertip along one of the shards, feeling the fine bite of the edge. A fall down the stairs would not account for this. Glass rarely breaks without intention, and when it does, it leaves a scatter that travels. I could see only a few splinters here, gathered on the cabinet beneath, as though placed there after the fact. Lewis, standing near the desk, was leafing through a slim volume with the caution of a man who fears breaking something. He tilted it, so I could see. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. A battered edition, spine worn soft. One page had been underlined in a dark, steady hand. The moving finger writes, and, having writ, moves on. I read it twice, not for meaning, I knew the line well enough, but for the pressure of the pen, the way it had indented the paper faintly onto the following page. She had worked for the Ashmolean on occasion, Lewis told me, mostly on minor pieces, nothing that would excite the tabloids. She lived alone, no immediate family. A neighbor had found her, called it in. The attending officer had noted no sign of struggle. I moved slowly about the room, eyes catching on small dissonances. A stack of brushes still damp at the bristles. A single wine glass on the kitchen counter, rinsed but not dried. The faint outline on the wall behind the frame, darker where the light had not reached for years, suggested the missing painting had been there long enough to leave its ghost. From the upstairs landing, the stairs fell steeply, more a ladder than a passage. A misplaced step here could be dangerous, yes, but only if one were moving in haste, or pushed. Back in the sitting room, I looked again at the frame. Without its canvas, it felt accusatory, a question asked without hope of answer. The broken glass turned the reflection of the window into a thing distorted, the outside world sliced into shapes that no longer fitted together. Lewis asked if I thought it meant anything. I told him everything meant something, but the trick was knowing what not to chase. Still, I could not quite imagine a woman like Margaret Ainsworth allowing such an object to hang there in its ruin, unless it was meant to be seen. The underlined verse returned to me. Moves on. Perhaps she had known she was running out of time, or perhaps the line was for someone else entirely, someone who would stand here after she was gone and wonder why those words had been chosen. We left with the frame still watching us from the wall and the faint smell of turpentine clinging to my coat. As Lewis started the car, I caught sight of a small shard of glass lodged in the tread of my shoe. I took it out carefully and placed it in my pocket. One never knows which fragments will prove necessary later. St. Cuthbert's sits a little apart from the Oxford most people imagine, its front gate opening onto a square of stone and silence that feels almost monastic. The drizzle had begun again by the time I arrived, and the porter, a man of compact build with eyes that seemed to measure everything in ounces of trouble, took my name with the weary courtesy reserved for those who have no right to be there and yet must be tolerated. Inside, the air was as I remembered from other colleges, a mingling of old wood, polish, and the faint mineral cool of stone not yet warmed by the day. The provost, Dr. Lionel Rafe, received me in a high-ceilinged office where the shelves seemed to bow slightly under the weight of their contents. He was the sort of man whose clothes looked expensive without ever appearing new, his voice pitched in that mild register academics cultivate, as though the world might fracture under anything more forceful. He spoke of Margaret with a kind of detached affection. Modest brilliance, he called it, and an unassuming charm. She had, apparently, kept in touch in a loose, occasional way. Christmas cards, notes about exhibitions. When I asked about her last commission, the warmth in his manner cooled by half a degree. He claimed not to know the details, only that it was private work, nothing to do with the college. His eyes wandered towards the window as he said this, watching rain stripe the leaded panes. It was on a side table, half buried under a stack of Cuthbertian reviews, that I saw the photograph. A formal group, dated 1974 in neat white script along the border. Young men in gowns and dark ties, women in the plain blouses and skirts of that time. Margaret was there, second from the right, her hair long, her gaze direct. Beside her stood a young man whose features caught at some recess of recognition. The curve of the jaw, a certain tilt of the mouth, the air of someone faintly apart from the group even while standing within it. I asked who he was. Rafe glanced briefly, said the name Edmund Selby, and moved on without elaboration. The name, like the face, stayed with me. The bursar, when I found him in an office smelling faintly of damp paper and pipe tobacco, was less guarded in manner but no more forthcoming in substance. He was a tall, spare man with a frown that seemed permanent, his fingertips stained with ink. Yes, Margaret had been a student here. Yes, she had been well thought of, academically. There had been, he added in an offhand way, a minor scandal in those days. Something to do with an essay competition and accusations of plagiarism. The details, he said, had been overblown and quickly forgotten. When I pressed, he waved the matter aside as ancient history, best left in the archives where it belonged. I wandered the quad after that, the flagstones slick underfoot, the grass inside the cloister a vivid green against the pale stone. Somewhere in the upper floors, a piano was being played, haltingly, as though the fingers had not yet decided what piece they intended. The sound reached me in fragments, carried by the shifting air. I thought of the photograph again. The ease in Selby's stance, the quiet certainty in Margaret's eyes. Whatever had bound those two in the frame, friendship, rivalry, something else entirely, it had been set down in the emulsion for decades, waiting for someone to notice. As I left, the porter offered a nod that was almost conspiratorial, though whether in sympathy or warning I could not tell. On the street outside, the bells from a nearby chapel began to sound the quarter hour, each note dissolving quickly in the wet air. I found myself wondering, not for the first time, how many lives could be traced in Oxford simply by following the echoes of its past, and whether Margaret's last steps had been taken in the shadow of something begun here long before she died. The inn was the sort of place whose best years had passed before anyone thought to record them. A low-beamed ceiling pressed the air down into something close to silence, the smell of polished oak mingling with a faint, lingering trace of last night's fire. A single figure sat at the far end of the bar, reading a newspaper folded into a narrow strip, his drink untouched beside him. I was not here for him. The register lay on the counter, bound in cracked leather, its pages creased from years of hesitant signatures. The entries were in the usual jumble of careful loops and impatient scrawls. Couples from the home counties, businessmen staying a night between meetings, the occasional tourist from abroad whose name seemed to carry more consonants than breath. And then, there it was. Edmund Selby, the ink no more than 2 days old. The name brought back the photograph from St. Cuthbert's. Selby standing beside Margaret Ainsworth, both young, their expressions giving nothing away. I remembered Rafe's reluctance when I asked about him, the faint tightening in his manner. The landlord, a stout man with the resigned cheerfulness of one who knows too much about his clientele, confirmed that Selby had taken a room for a single night. Yes, he was still about. Yes, he would speak to me, though the tone suggested the speaking would be done on his own terms. I found him in the lounge, a glass of claret in hand, the deep red catching the firelight. He rose with a civility that was almost convincing, introducing himself as though I might not already know. His hair was graying at the temples now, his suit of a cut that announced expense without advertising it. We talked as people do when they are measuring one another. I mentioned Margaret's name, watching for the smallest shift. He smiled faintly, as though amused by a memory. Hadn't seen her in decades, he said, though he had heard of her work from time to time. Then, casually, he remarked that he'd always liked her flat. Light in the mornings, quiet at night. It was the sort of slip that passes unnoticed unless you're listening for it. Margaret had lived in a terraced house, not a flat. The difference was more than architectural. It suggested presence, familiarity, knowledge you couldn't get from a decades-old recollection. Selby went on to tell me, with the ease of a man used to curating his own narrative, that he had been in London the night she died, attending the opera at Covent Garden. Verdi, a production he described in detail, lingering on the lead soprano's voice as though it were the real subject of interest. I let him talk. Later, alone at the bar with my own glass of claret, I studied the opera program he had provided. The paper still held the faint scent of someone else's cologne, the ink rich against the cream. Near the bottom, a line from La Traviata had been printed for some promotional flourish, except it was wrong. A single word altered, subtly, but enough to catch in the mind of anyone who knew the piece. Selby had repeated the line in conversation exactly as it appeared there, which meant he had read it. Why that detail stayed with me, I couldn't quite say. Perhaps because a man with his background would know the original by heart. Perhaps because misquotation, like broken glass, is a kind of fracture, a sign something has been altered from its true form. Outside, the evening had drawn in. A few cars passed on the wet road, their headlights spreading across the inn's low windows before vanishing into the dark. Selby was still in the lounge, speaking now to the man I'd seen earlier at the bar, his body turned half away, the way one does when keeping a conversation just out of earshot. I finished my wine slowly, the taste of it lingering longer than I'd expected. Some details, however slight, have a way of lodging in the mind until they demand an explanation. And in my experience, those are the details that matter. Lewis arrived at my flat with the look of a man who had spent the morning in the company of dust. He placed a folder on the table with something close to ceremony, then went to pour himself tea without asking. Inside the folder lay a hard-backed notebook, its cloth cover worn thin at the edges, the corners darkened by years of use. Margaret's handwriting was small, precise, the sort of script that comes from long hours among catalogues and accession records. The diary, though it was hardly that in any personal sense, charted her restoration work in careful, almost obsessive detail. Each entry began with the date, the dimensions of the piece, the medium, a list of pigments, followed by notes on damage and intended methods of repair. On some pages, delicate pencil sketches showed sections of ornamentation, the curl of a leaf in a frame, the fall of a sleeve in a painted figure. Others bore neat swatches of color, the edges feathered where she had tested her brush. There was an almost devotional quality to it, the kind of attention that treats an object not merely as a possession, but as something entrusted. And then there were the absences. Whole pages gone, removed with the care of someone who did not want the torn edges to betray the theft. The gaps came towards the end of the book, as though the record of her last work had been deliberately excised. From what remained, I could piece together fragments of that final commission. A pre-Raphaelite portrait, unnamed in the notes, damaged along the lower edge, The paint cracked, some areas flaked away to reveal the ground beneath. The client was not recorded, which in itself was unusual. She wrote of it being privately held, in a house she did not name, and she referred more than once to her discomfort. Ethically troubling, the phrase appeared twice, underlined once in a hand that pressed harder than her usual. In the margin of one page, between pigment codes and varnish ratios, she had written something in a smaller, tighter script, as if reluctant to give the word space. Glass hides more than it shows. I read it again, letting the phrase settle. In the sitting room of her house, that empty gilt frame had seemed like a riddle. Broken glass above an absence. And now, here was Margaret, in her own hand, speaking of glass as a concealment rather than a protection. I thought of the painting's missing canvas, the possibility that something had been placed behind it. A document, a smaller work hidden from view, perhaps even something fixed between the canvas and its lining. It would not be the first time a painting had served as a vault for secrets, but it would take more than speculation to make such an idea useful. Lewis, still standing by the window, remarked that the diary had been found in a drawer beneath a stack of invoices. He had checked the rest of the drawers. No other notebooks, no loose pages, no photographs. The invoices themselves were unremarkable, stretching back years, listing the slow trickle of commissions that made up Margaret's life's work. Nothing to suggest she had been living beyond her means or involved in anything more dramatic than the usual quiet politics of the art world. Yet the phrase would not leave me. Glass hides more than it shows. In the crossword of my mind, it was a clue without a filled-in answer, hovering there, waiting for the right crossing letters. I closed the diary and slid it back into the folder. The room was growing darker, the light outside thinning into that winter grey that robs colour from everything. I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the high street, the occasional burst of rain against the glass. Somewhere in Oxford, there was a portrait that had passed through Margaret Ainsworth's hands in the last weeks of her life. A portrait she had found troubling, a portrait now possibly missing. I could not yet see its significance, only the outline it left, like the faint shadow on a wall where a picture had hung too long. Lewis asked whether we should try to track the painting through the Ashmoleans' records. I said yes, though we both knew it would not be in the Ashmoleans' records at all. This was private work, and the private things are always harder to find, and, more often than not, the ones worth finding. It came to me, as so many of my best and worst ideas do, in the small hours. I was at my desk with a cold cup of tea, staring at the diary's cryptic note, when the lines began to connect themselves. The painting Margaret had been working on, the pre-Raphaelite portrait with the troubling provenance, had not been merely damaged. She had realized it was not what it claimed to be. A forgery, I told myself, and not just any forgery, but one that, if exposed, could embarrass a man like Edmund Selby beyond repair. Selby, after all, had the means, the access, and the slippery disdain for authority that always signals a man who considers himself uncatchable. If Margaret had threatened to reveal the truth or even hinted at it, he would have seen her as a danger. In the art world, reputations are currency. Ruin a man's name, and you might as well burn his banknotes. I tested the theory aloud to Lewis the next morning in the CID office. He looked skeptical in the way only Lewis could. Not openly defiant, but with the slow blink of a man politely bracing for disappointment. Still, he had news of his own. Selby's fingerprints had turned up on a wine glass in Margaret's kitchen. The print was clear, no smudge, no doubt. I felt the pleasure of a theory hardening into something more like proof. He'd been there. The denial about not having seen her in decades was a lie. The whole picture began to arrange itself, an unplanned visit, a confrontation over the forgery, perhaps a raised voice, the flash of anger in a man used to having his way. And then silence, the kind that lingers after something irreversible. By the time we knocked on Selby's Chelsea door that afternoon, I was carrying not just my coat, but the quiet satisfaction of a man about to spring a well-laid trap. Selby received us with the air of one humoring distant relatives. A smile without warmth, a studied casualness in the way he leaned against the doorway. I laid out the case as cleanly as I could, keeping my tone neutral, factual, as though this were all just an unfortunate matter that could be cleared up if he were willing to be reasonable. The wine glass, the fingerprints, the lie about the decades, the forgery. He listened without interruption, but as I spoke I could see something gathering at the corner of his mouth. Not fear, but amusement. When I had finished, he laughed. It wasn't the nervous, high-pitched laugh of the cornered, but a deep, almost indulgent sound, as though I'd just performed a decent card trick. "My dear Inspector," he said, "if I had murdered Miss Ainsworth, I can assure you I wouldn't be so clumsy as to leave a wine glass with my fingerprints in her sink. As for the decades remark, I saw her at an exhibition last year. We exchanged pleasantries. No more than that. I didn't think it worth mentioning." Then he went to a desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew an envelope. From it, he produced 2 neatly folded train tickets. Oxford to London, and London to Oxford, both date-stamped for the day Margaret died. Alongside them, an opera program. I felt a small twist in my chest as I recognized the misquoted Verdi line, the very one that had bothered me. "I was in London," he continued smoothly, "at the opera with friends. You can ring them if you like. The train was late. There's a report in the Times about the delay. I imagine you'll find it all matches up." Lewis, ever practical, took the items and examined them. They were genuine. I could see that at a glance. There was no tremor in Selby's voice, no telltale shift in his expression. If he was lying, he had perfected the art. As we left, Lewis muttered something about the prince still being suspicious, but I knew better. A man with a perfect alibi can't be cracked by insisting he hasn't got one. My tidy theory lay in ruins, and with it came the old familiar sting, that mix of irritation and reluctant admiration for the way the truth resists neat conclusions. The rain had begun again by the time we reached the car. I stood for a moment under the awning, feeling the cold air bite at my face. Somewhere in all this, I had taken the wrong turning. The trouble was, I couldn't yet see where. The rain had not let up the following morning, drumming on the skylight in the archives reading room like the slow ticking of a stubborn metronome. St. Cuthbert's College was quiet in the August recess. No undergraduates to clutter the corridors, only the low hum of radiators and the smell of dust disturbed by old paper. The archivist, a thin woman with hair the color of pewter filings, greeted me with the faint smile of someone whose loyalty was to the documents rather than the people who produced them. Lewis and I had been led here by a half-formed hunch that somewhere in Margaret's years at the college, something had been recorded that might explain the hesitations and evasions in the provost's manner. "I found something you may consider curious," the archivist said, sliding a cloth-bound volume across the table. The cover was embossed with the saint, Cuthbert's Review, Hilary Term, 1974. She had marked a page with a square of acid-free card. There it was, a poem by 1M Ainsworth. At first glance, it was an exercise in the ornate, slightly overwrought style fashionable among earnest students. Fragments of pastoral imagery, references to medieval glasswork, and a closing couplet about truth and fracture. But then I noticed the first letters of each line. My eye ran down them, and the name appeared as plainly as if it had been typed R-A-F-E. "An acrostic," I murmured, tracing the capitals with my finger. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, brow furrowed. "Could just be a coincidence," he offered, without much conviction. But I knew better. The poem's imagery felt deliberate. One stanza, in particular, snagged my attention. A glass that broke but showed no crack, holding within the shape of what it lacked. It was the kind of line that masquerades as romantic opacity, but, in the right light, reads like an accusation. I copied it into my notebook. A glass that broke but showed no crack. What could that mean except something damaged beneath a polished surface? I closed the book gently and thanked the archivist. The provost received us in his panelled study, the same one where he had earlier spoken of Margaret's modest brilliance with a fond smile that never quite reached his eyes. Today, that smile faltered the moment I placed the photocopy of the poem on his desk. "You knew her well, didn't you?" I asked. His fingers drummed lightly on the oak desktop. "Many students passed through St. Cuthbert's in those years, Inspector. I was a young lecturer, and she was a talented undergraduate," I finished for him. "Talented enough, perhaps, to write a dissertation that someone else might find useful." His eyes flicked to mine then, quick and sharp, before he glanced away towards the mullioned window. "I see you've come across the poem," he said after a pause. "Yes, Margaret and I were close once." I said nothing, letting the silence do its slow work. "It ended," he went on, rather abruptly. "She accused me of plagiarizing her research for my own paper. An absurd notion. My field was medieval iconography. Hers was architectural glass restoration. There was some overlap, but nothing more." Lewis, from his chair by the fire, asked mildly, "And the glass that broke but showed no crack? What's that about?" The provost gave a tight smile. Poetic flourish. Margaret was fond of metaphor. She believed our parting was the result of some betrayal on my part. I had in truth simply lost the stomach for entanglement. Academic politics were difficult enough without romantic scandal. It was meant to sound dispassionate, but I caught the faint tremor in his voice. Not of guilt, but of someone touching a memory they'd rather leave untouched. "Did you ever see her after she left the college?" I asked. "Once, perhaps twice," he said. "Always in public settings. There was nothing more to say." I slipped the poem back into its folder, but the lines lingered. Margaret's choice to hide his name in the text was no accident. Nor, I suspected, was her mention of broken but uncracked glass. In her world, glass was never just glass. It was history, fragility, and the craft of making the flawed seem perfect. As we left the study, I caught Lewis looking at me. "You think he's lying?" he asked. "Not entirely," I said. "But he's not telling us the whole of it either. And with glass, as with people, what you don't see is often what matters most." The weather had decided to imitate our case, grey, changeable, and untrustworthy. By the time I reached Kidlington, the rain had given way to a thin, metallic sunlight that made the streets look like they'd been dusted with powdered lead. Lewis was already in my office, a newspaper folded under his arm, an expression halfway between triumph and caution. "I think we've got something," he said, placing a thin folder on my desk. "A sighting 2 nights before Margaret died. Witness swears they saw Harry, the locksmith Keenan, hanging about her street." The name was familiar, unpleasantly. So, Keenan was an old-fashioned sort of burglar, the kind who could open a Chubb lock with the delicacy of a violinist tuning his instrument. His speciality was art theft, though the phrase gave him a sort of glamour he didn't deserve. The truth was, he stole what could be carried and sold quickly, with the occasional foray into high-end burglary when a commission presented itself. Lewis laid out the supposed sequence. Margaret had that portrait in her flat. Keenan breaks in, she disturbs him. There's a struggle. She falls down the stairs, fits with the missing painting, fits with no signs of forced entry. He's done jobs just like it. On the surface, it did fit. I could almost see the headline, "Oxford art historian dies in botched burglary." But something in the neatness of it felt synthetic, like a puzzle with too few pieces left over. We went through the file. Witness statements, Keenan's known associates, a few grainy CCTV stills that could have been him or any number of thin, balding men with cheap leather jackets. The final page was his current address, H.M. Prison, Bullingdon. Visiting hours are never the most edifying part of the job. The smell in the visiting hall, disinfectant mixed with an undertone of cold tea, always struck me as the true aroma of wasted time. Keenan shuffled in, wearing prison-issue grey and an expression of amused curiosity. "Well, if it isn't the famous Inspector Morse," he said, as though we were old club acquaintances. "What brings you to my humble residence?" I slid a photograph of Margaret across the table. "You were seen near her home 2 days before she died." His eyes flicked down, then up again, bland as ever. "Don't know her." "She had a portrait in her flat," I said. "Might have been worth something. Worth enough for you to take a risk." Keenan leaned back in his chair and grinned, showing a line of small, crooked teeth. "I've got rules, Inspector. Everybody's got to have rules, don't they? Your rules being, I don't touch paintings with glass." The answer was so unexpected I almost laughed. "Why on earth not?" "Glass is trouble. Cuts, reflections, glare, all sorts of ways for something to go wrong. You knock a frame with glass, it makes a noise, maybe breaks, and then the piece isn't worth half what it was. Nah. Give me a good clean canvas or something I can roll up and walk away with. You can keep your glass." I regarded him for a long moment. "So, you're saying you didn't take it?" "I'm saying I wouldn't. And I didn't. If I'd been after that painting, I'd have left it right where it was. You can ask anyone who's ever hired me. Glass is for glaziers, not burglars." There was a flicker of something in his tone. Not virtue, but a kind of professional pride. And irritatingly, I believed him. Lewis and I walked back to the car in silence. Outside, the sun had given up, and the sky was the color of dishwater again. "So that's it then," Lewis said finally. "We're back to square one." "Not quite," I said. "We've learned the thief didn't take it, which means either someone else did, or it was never about the painting in the first place." Lewis sighed. "And the glass thing? Odd little detail, isn't it?" I said, starting the engine. "Sometimes the smallest quirks tell you more than the grand theories." As the prison gates slid shut behind us, I felt the familiar shift in the puzzle. One neat solution discarded, another absence to explain, and the sense, growing sharper, that Margaret's death was tangled up with something far more deliberate than a chance burglary gone wrong. The Ashmolean after hours has a quiet unlike any other part of Oxford. The vast rooms, emptied of the usual murmur of tourists and students, hang in a stillness so profound it presses against the skin. The polished floors catch the weak glow of spotlights, casting long shadows that stretch like memories across the gallery walls. I stood before a gilt frame nearly identical to the one that had hung, empty and accusing, in Margaret's sitting room. The carving was intricate, leaves and scrolls curling into themselves like a whispered secret. The glass was unbroken here, held firmly in place by tiny brass pins. I reached out to touch the smooth surface, feeling the cool tension of glass that held both protection and concealment. It was then that I noticed the reflection, not just of the room behind me, but of myself, dimmed and slightly fractured by the subtle imperfections in the glass. A mirror disguised as a window. This reflection was deceptive. It could hide as much as it revealed. What if Margaret had seen something not in the painting, but in the glass that covered it? A detail lurking just beyond the obvious, caught in the shifting light and angles, overlooked by everyone but her. As I traced the edge of the frame with my finger, a sudden memory stirred. The young woman in the red scarf, crossing the quad at Magdalen, her heels clicking against stone, a fleeting figure carrying more weight than she seemed. That image had returned to me countless times, like a shadow cast from some unseen light. I wondered then if she had ever visited Margaret, or if the scarf was a token of some connection lost in time. Perhaps she was the one who brought the painting, or who noticed what the rest of us had missed. Returning my gaze to the glass, I imagined how, in certain light, the surface could reveal what lay behind, or reflect the observer's own face, a silent witness to the truth. If Margaret had discovered something in that reflection, it might have been a signature hidden in a corner, a figure lurking in the background, or an unexpected mark left by the artist or forger. I pulled from my coat pocket the small shard of glass I had pocketed weeks before, lifting it to the light. It caught the glow and fractured, it scattering the faint outline of a face across my palm. The fragment was a piece of the puzzle, a silent fragment of a fractured story. I knew then that the answer was neither in the missing painting nor the obvious suspects, but in the imperfect reflection, the hidden truth that could only be seen by those willing to look beyond the surface. Outside, the night had fallen fully, and the ancient stones of Oxford whispered their secrets into the darkness. Somewhere, beneath the layers of paint and broken glass, the frame held its silent testimony, and I, in my quiet way, was beginning to listen. The provost's office was quieter than I expected. The usual clutter of books and papers seemed muted, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The rain, which had dogged the case from the beginning, pattered softly against the leaded windows, a gentle percussion on the stone. Dr. Lionel Rafe sat behind his desk, fingers interlaced, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the shelves. I closed the door with a soft click and took the seat opposite him, careful to keep my voice low, measured, a tone for truths that arrive not in thunder, but in whispers. "You knew what Margaret discovered," I began. The painting she was restoring wasn't just a pre-Raphaelite portrait. It was a mirror, not in the literal sense, but in how it reflected something nearby. His eyes flicked up, sharp and wary. "I don't follow, Inspector." I leaned forward slightly, watching the way the shadows played across his lined face. Behind that frame, hidden from view, was a document. The college will, altered and concealed. The room seemed to still further. He swallowed, the movement slow, deliberate. "That will," I continued, "changed everything. It ensured your rise to provost. Margaret recognized it immediately. It threatened your position." His gaze dropped to the floor, fingers tightening. "It was never meant to be discovered," he murmured. I told him about the argument. Voices raised in frustration, the desperate attempt to silence a threat that had grown too large to ignore. The shove, unintended in its force, the tragic fall that broke her neck. He did not deny it. Instead, tears welled quietly, not for Margaret, but for the ruin that spread before him like a slow poison. "The glass," he said hoarsely, "was shattered in that moment. The frame emptied because the painting, and the truth it concealed, had to be erased. His confession was a silent surrender, a man undone not by hatred, but by the weight of ambition and fear." I sat back, the rain tracing cold paths down the window pane. In the end, it was not vengeance that marked his downfall, but the quiet fracture of trust, the very thing Margaret's work had sought to preserve. As I left the room, the air heavy with unspoken remorse, I thought of the shattered glass once more. It was a reminder that even the strongest surfaces can break, and in their breaking, reveal the most fragile truths. The turf tavern smelled exactly as it always did, of spilled beer, worn wood, and a faint trace of old smoke that clung stubbornly to the rafters. Lewis, ever hopeful for a companion to share a pint, clapped me on the shoulder as we entered. But I shook my head, the weight of the day pressing down with a quiet insistence. "Not tonight, Lewis. I think I'll take a glass somewhere quieter." He frowned, but said nothing. Outside, the rain pattered softly against the cobblestones, the streets glistening under the faint glow of gas lamps, their light fracturing in puddles like scattered jewels. I found myself at the Randolph, a sanctuary of polished wood and deep leather chairs, a place where solitude could settle without rushing. The waiter, recognizing the habitual patron, brought a modest glass of red wine, the color rich and dark as spilled blood, a fitting companion for the thoughts crowding my mind. Margaret Ainsworth, the restorer, the woman who saw beyond the surface, occupied my thoughts as though she were a portrait sketched in the dim corners of my memory. The way she had tended to art, with a reverence that bordered on love, seemed almost an echo of my own quiet obsessions, the pursuit of truth in the layers beneath. But truth, I reflected, is rarely as pure as we imagine. It wears disguises, beauty and betrayal sharing the same gilded frame, the same delicate glass that hides and reveals in equal measure. I thought, too, of the young woman in the red scarf, the fleeting figure who had crossed Magdalen's quad, a whisper of something lost or forgotten. Perhaps she was a reminder that some mysteries linger beyond resolution, that some shadows refuse to be caught in full light. The city around me hummed quietly, the rain threading a steady rhythm against the window panes. Somewhere, late-night footsteps echoed on stone, and a distant clock marked the slow passage of time. I raised my glass in a solitary salute, not to justice, which is often messy and incomplete, but to the fragile beauty of things broken and mended, of stories half told and secrets kept. Lewis would finish his pint without me, and the world would turn again, its complexities unchanged. But in this moment of stillness, I allowed myself the melancholy pleasure of knowing that, for all the darkness, there was still light to be found, even if only in a quiet drink in the dark. The flat was quiet, save for the soft tap of rain against the window pane. Evening shadows pooled in the corners, swallowing the edges of bookshelves and the worn leather chair where I often sat, pondering the endless layers of the cases I carried like old ghosts. Above the mantelpiece hung a print I'd acquired years ago. An empty frame, ornate and gilded, its glass flawless, untouched by time. I'd always found something haunting in its silence, a paradox of presence and absence that echoed the mysteries I sought to unravel. Tonight, I replaced the fading landscape that had occupied that space for some years with the empty frame. I stepped back, allowing the room to hold its breath around it. The glass caught the dim light of the bedside lamp, reflecting a fragment of the room and me, fractured and whole all at once. I stared for a long while, tracing the subtle imperfections in the gilded edges, the way the glass divided reality from illusion, concealment from revelation. The frame was a vessel, a keeper of stories, and yet, in its emptiness, it spoke more profoundly than any image it could hold. It was always the glass that breaks, I thought, the delicate barrier meant to protect, yet so easily shattered. The picture beneath remains, unchanged and silent, even as the world outside fractures and falls away. A sigh rose from somewhere deep within, quiet and unbidden. The city breathed beyond the window, the rain tapping a steady rhythm, and in that moment I was reminded once again that the truth, like the glass, is fragile, and the fractures it leaves behind can never be fully repaired. Turning away, I left the frame to its silence, the empty space a testament to all that is lost, concealed, or forever waiting to be found.